So, can students expect the same amount of support that they've received in the past with our reduced staff that we have here?
So can students expect the same amount of support as they have in the past with reduced staff now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, I think there are probably two ways to think about that question. One is, do we have reduced staff relative to the size of the student body? And I think the answer to that is not really, right? That proportionally, the reductions in our budget and our staffing track pretty closely reductions in the student body, right? So the numbers are pretty close. That said, when you get smaller, that means there's fewer functions, right? So there are in some places there are fewer people doing what more people used to do, which means that there's less of an opportunity at any given point for students to take advantage of those services. So I think in that sense, while resource-wise it would seem that there shouldn't be a reduction, in practice there clearly has been. And I think the other challenge here is that the reductions in the size of staff were done by necessity in a kind of an unplanned way, because we were trying very quickly to essentially cut 20% out of the budget, and so we ended up cutting, I think, people who would leave and not be replaced, rather than saying, well, what we really need to do is get rid of these 5 people and hire these 4. Not that we want to get rid of people, but those reductions were not sort of sat down and say, well, where should we be ideally in our staffing to make sure that a smaller student body has the same kinds of supports, and that didn't happen. So there's clearly less now than there would have been a year ago, and I think that's likely to get better, but it's going to continue to be. There's going to continue to be challenges there, because as our student body grows and we get back to full enrollment over the next 4 years, our budget can't grow as quickly. The reason that we ended up in a position where we were in last year, where the previous president thought we couldn't stay open, was precisely because we were spending so much more money than we bring in. And so part of the challenge that we have right now is to figure out how to more effectively use a smaller pool of revenue to provide students a quality experience.
I guess that kind of leads into my other question is, if we grow our admissions and more students come, will we be able to either rehire folks like professors and faculty, or rehire or hire new people to fill those gaps?
So again, I want to be real careful about the way that I answer this, because there's a staffing question and there's a faculty question, right? And so on the faculty side, nobody has been involuntarily let go. There were retirements, or some people who left for other jobs, but right now there's close to the equivalent of 30 faculty members who are under contract as full-time faculty members at Hampshire, who are either teaching at others of the 5 colleges or are doing reduced loads here. As we grow back to full enrollment, the amount of money we're going to be able to spend on faculty is not going to grow enough to cover all of that, right? I mean, that's, we can cover, I think, a lot of it, or some of it, well, although some of this depends on how we allocate resources within the college, but it's pretty clear we're not going to be able to have as many faculty, even at full enrollment, as we would have had last year. Just like we can't have as many of any other staffing area as we had last year, because if we did that, we would immediately back in the situation we were before, where we couldn't afford to stay open. So the question, I think, becomes, over the next 4 years, how do we smooth that path, and what ends up being the right balance between the number of faculty we need and the number of students we have, and then how do we, once we know that, how do we figure out where we're going to spend everywhere else? Right? So that's on the faculty side. That's a slightly different question because of the tricky thing right now is you have all these people on leave, and some of them will come back, but some other people may go off on leave, and so we've got to, over the course of the next 4 years, how do we end up where we need to be? On the staffing side, we're going to be able to grow a little bit, but probably not a lot, right? And so again, there's the question of what is the best allocation of people within roughly the numbers we have.
Is there a way that current students can help out more and support the college in this journey?
Sure, there's a couple things students can do. One is to be a cheerleader for Hampshire College, as funny as that might sound, but the more positive impressions people outside of Hampshire have of Hampshire, and the more they hear about the really extraordinary things that our students do, the more likely people are to want to come here. And the more people that come here, the better our financial situation is, and the more we can do to provide the kind of resources we need for our students to continue to be successful. So that's a really important thing, is to people who, if you're having good experience at Hampshire College and you're finding your education to be satisfying and wonderful and unique, talk about it in public places and in public forums. I mean, that's a really important thing for students to do. So there's also, I think students sometimes think about, well, can we help with things like fundraising, and that is something where I think students don't really need to be worried about, in part because while there's a lot of, the most visible part of fundraising is often the small gifts, and those are really important. Fundamentally, when you're running a campaign to raise $10 million a year, most of that has to come from a small handful of people. And those are going to be people that we're going to have to cultivate long-term relationships with. And students sometimes have a role to play in that when those people come to a campus and they go walk around and they see projects and they get really impressed by their work. But the way that the students are having an impact there is by producing really impressive work and being really impressive people that our large and small donors alike can look at and say, wow, that's really incredible that students are doing that at Hampshire and they can't do it anywhere else. I really want to support that.
Speaking of all the incredible people on Hampshire campus, we did ask the Hampshire community if they had any questions for you. Because there's not such a great way to reach students on the campus. We only had maybe 4 or 5 people respond to the survey. I mean, they had to click a link. That's a lot of work to do, you know what I mean? So the people that did actually click the link and complete the whole survey, they were really, really passionate. And I'm telling you, these issues are issues that we cannot ask you to answer in this, few-minute interview that we have with you. But we do.
I can't tell if you're being facetious or not.
I'm not trying to be. I think it's really important that we're not just taking things from you with this interview. We actually want to give you something to take away from it as well. So we do want to read you these questions, and we don't expect for you to answer these. We can't ask you to answer these because you would need a lot more time to prepare yourself. But we do want to see how you react and make sure that you are aware that people who are really passionate really wanted you to answer these questions. So maybe you could answer them in the future somehow for us. So, Eloix.
Yeah, so how do you plan to make more students of color feel at ease on campus? What are some of the current reasons why students of color don't feel at ease on campus right now? That's the first one. And then the second one is, even though it is in accordance with Hampshire's contract policy, MIM is still being paid per the contract after she resigned in April to this date and a few months following now. This is beyond anyone's control. However, would you be willing to ask MIM for a donation to the school? Many students are starving in this college while graduating with tons of debt, while the white woman who tried to kill us all is still getting paid.
I told you, really passionate.
Yeah. That one I legally can't comment on, so I'm going to come back and answer that first question maybe. But.
As new courses are being designed and developed for the next chapter of learning at Hampshire College, will all faculty be given an opportunity to learn, unlearn, relearn the pedagogy and
Different words for pedagogy.
Okay, yeah. Relearn the pedagogy needed to guarantee success and ensure students-centered learning through inquiry and project-based learning around big global questions becomes the path. Some professors get this now and some do not.
Mm-hmm.
And then, what are you going to do to address sexual assault and interpersonal violence on campus? Are you concerned with building violence, conflict resolution methods outside of disciplinary Title IX process, example, transformative justice, especially given that many survivors do not feel safe going through a formal/legal accountability process? And then the final question is, do you plan to reach out to folks who have transferred because they couldn't move forward at Hampshire after classes and professors that they needed were cut? If not, why not? And if so, how and when?
If you want to take the iPad and like reread, if you want to have a response, I mean, we don't necessarily. You said you wanted to answer the first one. If you want to reread it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. Some of those are things that would be tricky to,
Yes.
to get into, particularly some of the legal implications for the second question. So, I think that first question is a really important one, and I think one of the things that we need to be honest with ourselves as a community about this, which is we have a stated commitment to building an anti-racist campus and an anti-racist culture. And it's a fine and wonderful commitment. It's one of the reasons that I was interested in coming to Hampshire College. But claiming to want to do something that lots of other places are not willing to claim. I fought this kind of a losing battle in previous campuses, previous colleges I've been with. They say, well, we should, it's not enough to be tolerant, to be diverse, to be welcoming. Those are all essentially saying, well, come to this place that doesn't belong to you and we'll try to make you feel comfortable here. Isn't sufficient. You should be actively anti-racist, that we need to be as uncomfortable as we are making people who are coming to a space that wasn't designed for them and has not historically been for them. And was unsuccessful in that, often because colleges are afraid to do that, right? They're afraid that making that commitment will lead to predominantly white students not wanting to choose to go to that college. So the fact that Hampshire has said, no, we're going to do that, or we're going to be committed to that, and we're going to say it publicly, even if it's going to scare people off, is great. But it also means then we have to do it. And so I don't think that we, as committed as we are to the idea, we aren't always doing a great job of figuring out what that means. And I'll give you just one quick example of this. And I've talked to a couple of people in the senior leadership about this. And Natalie Sola and I just had a conversation about this last week. Natalie is fabulous, right? So here's the conversation we were having. And I think it's a good analogy for thinking about how to pursue genuinely anti-racist campus. You think about how much energy and intent went into thinking about gender identification at Hampshire College and making people comfortable and at home and welcome and giving ownership to this place regardless of how one lives their gender. That was intentional. It took a lot of work. There were missteps here and there, and it made and continues to make some people really uncomfortable. Right? So if you're a cisgendered person who walks in off the street into Hampshire College, and you're not prepared for what Hampshire College is committed to, you're likely to go, ooh, I'm not sure this place is for me, right? I'm not sure I'm comfortable here, right? In other words, you have the experience walking into Hampshire College's space that a person of color has in almost every space, right? So that kind of commitment to take that on is the model for how one would take seriously being a genuinely anti-racist institution. And I don't think that we have pursued that in the same way and with the same visibility. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons is that as as difficult as it is sometimes for people to think about the challenges of creating an environment that is welcoming of all gender identifications, it's still something that emerged as a movement with some power behind it from the dominant culture. Right? It's harder to think about anti-racism in that way, right? And so that's a long way around to say, like, I think it's something it's really important to me. It's important to me in ways that I have failed over and over again and will continue to fail here. But it's one of the places where I think we can judge ourselves in really concrete ways about how seriously we are taking it in changing the way our environment, our culture, our lived experiences of this place changes. And if it always feels like a comfortable place for traditionally dominant white folks, then we aren't making that work. Now, the flip side of that is that sometimes then the substitute for making institutional progress is a kind of, well, let's just find ways to make people uncomfortable for uncomfortableness sake, right? And that doesn't work either. So, we got to figure out how that balance works. But it's a long way around of saying, yeah, I have lots of ideas about how we should do that and how we're not doing it, and less concrete ideas about how to make progress from here to there, other than to whenever you get a chance in a forum like this or a forum like Engage or any place else to make the point of saying this is what it would mean. It means these very hard things that we aren't always doing. So.
I want to thank you for such a thoughtful answer, especially with such an intense question and being unprepared. I do want to ask again, just sort of to take the kind of the role and responsibility off of you. After asking these questions and seeing that students are passionate, what can students do to help solve these problems? Like, do you have any ideas of how we can make the change ourselves?
Yeah, one of the things and I don't know how to, I haven't been here long enough to know how exactly to do this, but it does seem to me that there's a gap between the passion and energy for activism and social justice among many of the students, and the structures that would be necessary for that passion and that energy to translate into institutional changes at the college. And in part that's because the hard work of sort of building structures of representation and nurturing legitimacy so that people who can be put in positions to represent students are then trusted by students and not immediately seen as, well, you were elected to that position, so now you must be one of them, right? That those relationships of just sort of boring institutional design and trusting people, that seems something where it's someplace where it seems like something that Hampshire College has traditionally struggled with, right? And it's not just as simple as like, well, we need a student government, right? Well, okay, but student government is a way to think about how to have good mechanisms to get from activist energy to policy to institutionalization. And institutionalization is ultimately the goal of activist energy. And so I think to the extent we could be thinking as we move forward over the next year or two or a couple of years about how do students take more ownership of and build more institutions for their own participation in the governance process and in the building of Hampshire College, that would be really effective. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to compare it to these other issues, but I'll say, like, even just reaching out to the community to ask them for questions for you. Like, there's not really a system in place to address all of the student body in a way that is really convenient. And so if you're dealing with big issues like that, like, we can't even click links for a survey for a simple interview. Like, how are we going to connect in a way to do even bigger change?
Right, so you were being facetious about the link clicking being so hard, weren't you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it is actually a nice analogy for that, right? Or, if people have concerns that they that they want addressed and they don't have a mechanism to do it, what ends up happening, and this isn't unique to Hampshire College, this is how, I'm a political scientist, right? I study democratic theory. This is in part how democracies kind of can get off kilter, right? That you get a lot of demands that are going unmet and unrecognized, and they accumulate across populations of people, and then somebody comes along and says, you all have these problems that you're dissatisfied with, and the reason is this bad group of people over there, right? And that ties all of those particular grievances that aren't really related together in this kind of false alignment, right? This is how sort of right-wing populism works. And then we all go out and go after the bad person who caused our problems, who didn't cause our problems, right? But we have no other venue to try to express them meaningfully, and no venue that we see where we can find some kind of redress, even if the redress is to say, we see you and we can't do anything about it, right? And so there's a sense in which Hampshire kind of fosters that a little bit, right? That because there's not good mechanisms for people to be heard or to have some of their concerns addressed, or when there are good mechanisms, people don't trust them. Then you end up with these sort of accumulations that then somebody can come in and kind of take advantage of and say, I can bring you all together and mobilize your anger towards this thing that I really care about, right? And then now we've got this antagonistic movement, right? Rather than a kind of conflictual but productive way of engaging with disagreement. And so that's if we had lots of ways in which those concerns could filter through reliably and make it to the dean of students, the dean of faculty, the president, the council of student leaders, right, to SAN, then it might be easier for us to identify and solve problems than it has been in the past.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. Hopefully we can get you back in the future and keep working on these issues together.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's fun.